The wind on the Wyoming Plateau in 1887 was not a gentle sweep. It was a hard, persistent argument, scouring the skin and depositing a fine red dust that found its way into pockets, seams, and the very grain of wood. It was the sound of the territory speaking, and its voice was rough and demanding. Bitter Creek was a tiny, tough collection of structures huddled against the elements, surviving on the confluence of meager ranching, a sporadic vein of silver ore in the hills, and its grudging position along a main freight line running south to the Union Pacific Railway. Every nail driven here was driven out of necessity, not comfort. The town's economy, like the creek itself, was shackled. The true power didn't reside in the sheriff's star or the preacher's Bible. It sat in the large, imported oak desk of Simeon Graves. Graves, a man whose ambition was as dry and boundless as the land he controlled, had secured ownership of the Bitter Dam several years prior, slowly leveraging that control into dominance over the entire supply chain. He controlled the water that fed the lower ranches and the credit that kept the general store stocked. He influenced the circuit judge and kept a firm, often cruel, hand on the scales of local law for the small farmers and the few miners trying to scratch out a living. The phrase Graves's law held more weight than the actual territorial statutes. They were poor, and poverty here meant dependency on Graves's prices for flour, on his quota for water, and on his patience for the bills they couldn't pay. In a small, slightly ramshackle cabin near the upstream Liar's Willows, Cora Whitlock lived by two simple, self-imposed rules learned early in the territory: keep a straight back and keep clean hands. At 25, she carried the quiet strength of someone who had faced down an empty future and decided to build something sweet in its place. Her father, a good, hard-working man, had come west with dreams of irrigation, only to drown 2 years ago in a foolish, desperate attempt to dislodge a plank illegally jammed into the Bitter Dam sluice, a plank put there, everyone whispered, by Graves's men to raise the water level for the upstream mining claim. Her mother, Amelia, frail since the shock, needed constant care. Cora was the provider, earning her keep and her dignity through two distinct trades: beekeeping, which required patience, discipline, and an uncanny ability to read the mood of the hive, and tutoring the children of the few families who still valued reading and writing over breaking horses. Her bees were her quiet partners, representing the kind of relentless, necessary labor that built the West. Their buzzing was a steady song of industry, a stark contrast to the shifting sands of Graves's influence. Every drop of honey she collected was earned through sweat and sting, a testament to persistence. On the other side of town, where the freight wagons habitually parked, was the McAllister and Fry Mercantile, a building that smelled permanently of burlap, coffee beans, and boot leather. Bo McAllister, 31, was a partner in the store and a working cowboy. His past was a low, heavy shadow he seldom spoke of. He had spent years riding the dangerous Cheyenne to Dodge City Run, freighting everything from blankets to repeater rifles, a life of necessary, hair-trigger violence. That life was over. Now, he chose the slow, predictable rhythm of herding cattle and the monotonous logistics of running a store. He was a man of impressive physical presence, silent and observational, known in the community less for his words and more for the quiet, unbending fact of keeping his promises. If Bo McAllister said he would do a thing, it was as good as done. He had found a form of passive atonement in the deliberate banality of his new existence, seeking to replace the weight of the rifle butt with the weight of an honest ledger. But the quiet life was being rattled by the deep, systemic conflict that Graves stoked. The latest bulletin, delivered by a nervous traveling clerk, detailed massive price hikes on staples flour, salt, and most pointedly, sugar, and a further draconian cut to the water quota for all lands downstream of the dam. Graves was tightening the economic screws, leveraging his infrastructural control to destabilize the small landholders. The insidious rumor running through the low-ceilinged saloon was that Graves was preparing to call in the debts on the last few remaining creekside homesteads, the very pieces of land that were still independent of his sprawling ranch interests. Cora felt the squeeze not just in her stomach, but in her moral core. The holiday season was approaching, and she had promised the children a treat. She needed sugar, a decent supply of it, not just to make her special. Candied honeycomb preserves that helped her mother, but also to bake cakes for a fundraiser to keep the small, independent schoolroom open through the winter. This new, sudden price hike by Graves turned that essential ingredient, that small piece of civilized sweetness in a harsh world, into an unwarranted luxury. Almost a political statement. The cost per pound was now astronomical. A clear message to the poor: your small joys are taxable, and your children's education is secondary to my profit. The air of Bitter Creek was taut, restrained, yet crackling with the suppressed anxieties of its residents. Inside the smoky dimness of the Last Drop Saloon, the light humor of hard-bitten people sometimes cut the tension. You could hear Thomas Thorne, the massive blacksmith, arguing loudly with a cowhand over the temper of a horseshoe, his voice booming like hammer on anvil. Down the street, old Mrs. Hemlock, who ran the boarding house and was famed for constantly chewing on a plug of medicinal birch chaw, would hiss complaints about the dust and the poor quality of Graves's feed. Her comments delivered with the speed and sting of a coiled snake. It was gallows humor, the way people dealt with living under a thumb, but it kept the lid from blowing off. Cora looked at her small cache of late-season honey, already sealed in jars and ready for sale or trade. She knew she could not sell it all. Her mother depended on the cough syrup and preserves she made from it. She counted the meager pile of coins on the rough-hewn table, the tuition fees from the 2 children of the miner, the small payment from the local doctor for a pound of wax. It was not enough to purchase the required 5 pounds of sugar at Graves's new extortionate rate. The situation crystallized the ongoing struggle, embodying the initial symbols of the story. The bees and their honey represented honest, diligent labor, a direct challenge to the corrupted, leveraged wealth of Graves. The life-giving Bitter Creek was now literally and figuratively under lock and key. Its flow, controlled by the dam, a symbol of infrastructure, turned into pure, self-serving power. And the sugar, that sweet, rare commodity, became the immediate battleground, the tiny, critical ingredient whose availability separated survival from a small, necessary measure of hope and dignity. It is Graves's way of taxing kindness, Cora muttered to her reflection in the dusty glass of the window, adjusting the simple calico dress and squaring her shoulders. She slipped the small coin purse into her apron pocket, its weight ridiculously light compared to the burden of the necessity it represented. If she was to keep a straight back and clean hands, she had to face the dirtiest hands in town and ask for a fair measure. The sweet future she was trying to build for her students, for her mother, and for herself, depended on a 5-pound bag of granular white sweetness, now priced beyond the reach of honest people. She would make the attempt at the mercantile, hoping that McAllister and Fry still had some decency left in their ledger. Bitter Creek waited, holding its breath. The air inside McAllister and Fry Mercantile was a thick, breathing thing that afternoon. The heat pressing against the plank roof seemed trapped inside with the heavy, mingled scents of kerosene, salted pork, and the faint, sad odor of stale tobacco. The shelves, usually packed tight with the necessary clutter of frontier life, were noticeably spare in the section dedicated to dry goods. Cora Whitlock stood at the long counter, her spine rigid beneath the thin calico. She pulled the drawstring on her small purse and meticulously counted out her coins, laying them in 3 neat stacks on the worn wooden surface. The weight of the transaction felt far greater than the few dollars she offered. Facing her was Mr. Josiah Fry, the older half of the partnership. Fry was a jittery man whose perpetual anxiety had been magnified tenfold since Graves had started squeezing the supply lines. Fry constantly wiped his hands on a pristine apron, a habit that did nothing to hide the sweat beading on his forehead. 5 pounds of sugar, Mr. Fry, Cora stated, keeping her voice steady and polite. For the school fund baking. At the old price. Fry's smile was thin and nervous. like stretched cotton. Miss Cora, you know I'd dearly love to. You know I support your efforts to educate the youngsters. But the ledger, the new shipment, that's all at the Graves tariff. You see, if I sell it for the old price, my books won't balance. Your books will balance, Mr. Fry, if you choose to profit less. Cora countered without heat. Simeon Graves is charging you twice the freight for the same sacks. He doesn't own the sugar in your store yet, only the price tag you choose to hang on it. Fry glanced frantically toward the storage door, as if Graves himself might materialize from the dusty air. It's the agreement. Miss Cora, the credit agreement. If we break the set price, the whole line of credit is pulled. Then we've got no flour, no salt, no needles for the women, and no profit share for McAllister either. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, damp with fear. We can't cross Graves over a sack of sugar. He'll bury us in fines from the sheriff's office before sundown. Cora's shoulders drooped slightly, but she quickly pulled them back. Adhering to her own rule of maintaining a straight back, she looked down at the paltry stacks of silver and copper. Even if she pooled every penny she had, she would only get 2 pounds at the new, inflated cost, barely enough for her mother's preserves, let alone the children's treats. The sweetness of the town's future was being bought out by the bitterness of one man's greed. Just then, the heavy wooden door to the back storage room groaned open. Bo McAllister emerged, carrying a 70-pound sack of whole wheat flour effortlessly braced against his shoulder. He was dressed in denim and a simple gray shirt. The fabric stretched tight across the powerful set of his shoulders. His face was weathered, his movements economical. The only unnecessary gesture was the way he paused, not in his step, but in his intense, quiet assessment of the scene before him. He eased the flour sack down near the counter, the thud resonating like a decision. He watched Cora's frustrated posture and Fry's desperate wiping, then glanced at the small, earnest pile of coins on the counter. His gaze, usually so guarded, settled on Cora with a kind of plain, unblinking intensity. It was an honest look, one that didn't seek to categorize or judge, but simply to understand the true weight of her dilemma. Bo addressed his partner, his voice low and deliberate, cutting through Fry's nervous panting. Josiah, what's the ledger say on 5 pounds of sugar at cost, excluding Graves's freight markup? Fry stuttered, startled by his partner's sudden involvement. Well, the cost. Before the hike, it was 30 cents the pound less. Bo, but the profit margin... The profit margin will be the least of our worries if we look at Miss Whitlock and say we prefer Graves's comfort to her honest work, Bo said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unyielding force of a stone rolling downhill. He took a heavy, unmarked sack of sugar from beneath the counter, not the one on the shelf, which was marked with the new price, and placed it gently before Cora. He looked at Cora, and a faint flicker of dry amusement touched the edges of his calm eyes. What's the sugar for? Miss Whitlock seems like high stakes for a simple sweetening. Cora's surprise melted into a flash of spirit. It's for the children, Mr. McAllister. We're baking to raise funds to buy books, so they can learn to read the law, not just fear it. I need a receipt that says sugar for children learning to read. A slow, almost imperceptible nod affirmed Bo's resolve. Well, then, he replied, his tone conversational and matter-of-fact. I reckon letters are sweeter than any sugar if you're the one teaching them. And I reckon the town could use a little more sweetness that isn't imported via Graves's wallet. The dialogue was light and quick, a single spark of wit striking against the dark flint of the situation, and it brought a shared, almost private smile to the two of them, relieving the stifling tension. Bo took the coins Cora had laid out, counting them himself. He then opened the ledger, ignoring Fry's soft, panicked gasps. He drew a line beneath the previous sugar transaction and wrote the entry clearly in his precise hand. 5 pounds sugar. Old cost, paid in full. He then wrote a separate, private note in the margin, recording the deficit as a direct loss against his share of the store's profit. "There," Bo stated, handing the ledger back to the trembling Fry. "The town got its sugar at an honest price. The mercantile keeps its word." The book's balance. Josiah, just against a different pocket. Fry was too terrified to argue, merely snatching the ledger back and muttering about ruin and Graves's inevitable wrath. Bo, however, didn't spare another glance for the man. His attention was solely on Cora. She placed the coin she had left over back into her purse, but hesitated, then pulled out a few remaining pennies, trying to push them back toward Bo in a gesture of honest accounting. "This is too generous. Mr. McAllister, it's more than half your part of the profit. I can't." Bo gently placed his large, calloused hand over hers, stilling her motion. He didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the sack of sugar resting between them. His voice dropped lower still, a rough, warm murmur that sounded incredibly intimate in the dusty silence of the store. He eased the sack of sugar fully into her possession. He looked up then, meeting her gaze with an expression that was at once protective and deeply appreciative. It was a man's honest compliment, devoid of any leering crudity, delivered straight from his own code of honor. She came to buy sugar, he gave her his heart instead, saying, "Sweet enough for my virgin." Cora froze. The words, stripped of any gross implication by his sincerity and the context of the moral stand he had just taken, were a bold, tender declaration. They weren't about possession or desire, but about profound respect. He had just confirmed her worth and character by declaring that the pure, sweet dignity she carried was more than enough, both for the town and, implicitly, for him. He saw her not as a solitary beekeeper struggling under debt, but as an unspoiled source of goodness in a cynical world. The blood rushed immediately to Cora's face, turning her cheeks a vibrant crimson. She picked up the sugar sack, clutching it tightly, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "Well, Mr. McAllister," she managed, her voice shaking slightly but regaining its playful edge. "I hope your heart's not as heavy as this sack, or you'll never get it through a doorway, and I only paid you for sugar. Sir, keep your inventory straight." Bo's lips curved in the faintest, most genuine of smiles, the first full expression of relaxation she had ever seen him wear. "Ma'am, I've got the heaviest inventory in the territory, and I can move it just fine. You just worry about making those reading lessons sweet." Cora left the store quickly, the sack of sugar heavy and strangely comforting in her arms, her heart beating a rapid, unfamiliar rhythm. The immediate consequence of this moral defiance was predictable. The news of the price breaker and the honey woman's friend traveled faster than any telegraph. Graves, upon hearing the details, the open defiance, the cheap sugar for the poor, the public nature of the transaction, was furious. He saw not an act of charity, but a direct threat to his system of economic terror. The act of kindness had become the inciting incident. Graves immediately dispatched his most brutal foreman, Calder Pike, a man whose hands were far from clean and whose temper was short, to deliver a harsh physical warning to the store. Simultaneously, Graves applied pressure on Sheriff Hollis Vane, a man as cowardly as he was official, demanding Vane enforce the letter of the law regarding price collusion and trading regulations, using his badge to turn an honest deal into a crime. 2 days later, the air in Bitter Creek was thick with the scent of baking. Cora delivered the promised thank you, a dozen small, perfect, dense cakes sweetened with her own dark honey and the disputed white sugar. She found Bo alone in the back storeroom, meticulously repairing a damaged wagon wheel. The atmosphere was calmer, intimate with the quiet sounds of his focused labor. Cora set the cakes down on an overturned barrel. "Payment for the sweetness," she said, her voice soft. Bo stopped working, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at the cakes, a flicker of genuine pleasure crossing his face. He picked one up, inspecting the intricate structure of the comb print on the top. "You understand the work of the bee." "Miss Whitlock," he commented, taking a bite. "Hard work, straight lines, no wasted motion." "I do," Cora agreed, watching him eat. "And you understand the work of the horse." "Mr. McAllister, pure power, but only useful when guided by a steady hand. Which one are you more like?" He chewed slowly, considering, "I used to be the saddle, pushing the horse too hard. Now I try to be the horse, running straight, keeping my eye on the trail." They talked easily then, the conversation shifting from the intricate hierarchy of the hive to the subtle language of the trail horse, the twitch of an ear, the shift of weight. She explained how a queen's pheromones dictated the temperament of the entire colony. He explained how a horse's refusal to cross a certain point was often a sign of quicksand or a washout ahead. It was a conversation of deeply knowledgeable people who recognized the silent, disciplined labor in the other. This quiet, earnest exchange, this recognition of shared discipline and respect, was the true seed of their relationship. The attraction wasn't loud or volatile. It was the quiet, steady pull of shared values, a chemistry that burned low but intensely beneath the surface. But Bitter Creek was a small town, and its anxieties needed fuel. The widow Hemlock, Fry's wife, and other neighborhood gossips began to whisper. A young, unmarried woman spending time with an unattached, intensely private man, especially one with a shadowed past, was unacceptable in their social code. The women felt that Cora's fierce independence was an affront to their own limited choices, and Beau's quiet strength was too dangerous to be trusted. Cora, however, held her head high, focusing on her work and her mother. She would not let the poison of small-minded opinion bow her straight back. So Beau, true to his nature, chose silence. But his silence was no longer passive. He took to sitting on the long porch of the Mercantile in the evenings, conspicuously cleaning his rifle or whittling, his presence a quiet, unmoving defense. He didn't challenge the talk, but he stood beside the one they talked about, a silent, powerful warning to anyone who considered moving from gossip to open harassment. The stage was set, the town had its sugar, but the price of that sweetness, the price of Beau's moral action, was about to be exacted by Graves and his hired enforcers. The heat only seemed to intensify the pressure. As September melted into October, the air didn't cool. It simply held the dust closer, making every breath gritty. Simeon Graves, having tasted the sting of Beau's small defiance, retaliated with predictable cruelty. The water fee for all downstream irrigation, already onerous, was hiked another 30%, justified by a spurious claim of necessary maintenance on the Bitter Dam. The immediate consequence was that the creek bottom began to bake dry, the willow leaves curling in brittle brown spirals, but Graves, a master of diverting discontent, didn't let the anger settle on him. His foreman, Calder Pike, circulated rumors among the most desperate farmers, those already neck-deep in debt to the Graves ledger, that the beekeeper was to blame. "She's upstream, ain't she?" Pike sneered one afternoon outside the general store, spitting tobacco juice with deliberate force. "That's prime water for her wildflowers, for her little honey-making operation. Her damn bees are sucking the moisture out of the earth faster than the sun." The narrative, absurd as it was, took root among the stressed ranchers. The small, sweet industry of Cora Whitlock, which had once been a source of quiet pride, suddenly became a symbol of selfishness. Her dignity, her refusal to be poor in spirit, was misinterpreted as hoarding. Cora found herself pushed into direct social opposition. When she rode to the schoolroom, the widow Hemlock would pointedly refuse to meet her eye, and the younger farmers, whose crops were failing, would mutter about hoarders of water and virtue. Cora faced the animosity with her usual quiet resilience. She kept her head high, but she found herself taking the long, dusty route to the creek to check her hives, avoiding the main Bitter Creek road where the hostile eyes were sharpest. It was on that winding, lonely track, the one that ran closest to the bluff controlled by Graves, that the true confrontation came. Cora had dismounted, checking a newly placed hive box that felt suspiciously light. She was intent on the work, her attention focused entirely on the rhythmic buzz of the colony. When a shadow fell across the sun, she stood straight, her hands clean of mud but sticky with propolis. Calder Pike sat astride a massive roan, his presence blocking the narrow path. Pike was the physical embodiment of Graves's power broad, brutal, and utterly lacking in conscience. "Well, look at the little honeypot, out here counting her sticky gold," Pike drawled, his voice thick with malicious amusement. "Graves sent me with a suggestion. Ma'am, a kindness, you might say." Cora fixed her gaze on the bridge of his nose, refusing to look lower or flinch. "I do not take advice from hired intimidation. Mr. Pike, say what you have to say, and then clear the road." Pike chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Spunk. Always liked spunk. Here's the deal. Miss Whitlock, Graves is feeling generous. He'll buy your parcel. Cash money, and he'll take those noisy bugs of yours off your hands. 2. The answer is no," Cora stated flatly. "My father died defending his claim to that water. I will not sell the land that cost him his life to the man who profited from his death." Pike spurred his horse forward, crowding hers, forcing the mare back a step. He leaned down, his face too close, his breath foul. "It's not a request, sweetheart. It's a warning. You and your mama need protection. If you don't sell, well, sometimes these little shacks catch fire in a high wind. Or a fine lady loses control of her horse and takes a tumble down the bluff. Be smart. Get out. Sell the land. Sell the bees. And stop stirring up trouble at the mercantile." Pike reached out a hand, a thick, brutal instrument, and gripped the leather bridle just below the horse's jaw, attempting to force the mare's head down and assert dominance over both animal and rider. "Let go of my reins, Mr. Pike," Cora warned, her voice low and tight. "I told you to be smart," Pike repeated, tightening his grip. "Graves has got a long memory, and it's getting dusty around here. The dust gets everywhere." Before Cora could deliver the hard kick she was preparing, a second rider appeared silently from the brush at the edge of the cottonwoods. It was Bo McAllister. He hadn't made a sound, appearing like a sudden, necessary decision. He carried no weapon in his hands, but his stillness radiated a controlled, enormous threat. Bo didn't speak to Pike. He simply pulled his horse, a sturdy bay named Justice, alongside the roan. Without a word, he reached across the space, his movements economical and precise. He didn't punch, didn't shove, didn't even yell. He reached out, his hand wrapping around Pike's wrist, the one gripping Cora's bridle, and with a single, firm twist, he peeled Pike's fingers away from the leather. It was a clear, quiet display of superior control and strength, a warning delivered without a single shot fired. Pike yelped, a sound of surprise and pain, and jerked his hand back. He looked from his throbbing wrist to Bo's face, which was utterly devoid of emotion, like a rock formation. "Get off her trail, Pike," Bo said, his voice the softest thing on the entire plateau. Yet it cut through the afternoon silence like a rifle crack. "She's not a fence post, and those are her reins. Find your own way back to the dam." Pike glared, his mouth working silently, aware that any physical escalation would be met with an immediate, decisive, and likely painful response from the man known for keeping his peace but being lethal when pressed. He yanked his roan around, spitting a curse into the dust, and spurred the animal into a furious retreat. Cora let out a long, silent breath. She looked at Bo, who was already inspecting the cinch on his saddle as if nothing untoward had happened. "You have a convenient habit of turning up, Mr. McAllister," she said, managing a shaky smile. "I was running the north fence line," Bo replied, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Just saw a man treating a fine mare wrong. No need to thank me. I hate bad horsemanship." The moment of shared tension was broken by the sky itself. The high, dry wind, which had been a constant companion, began to escalate. The air turned orange-red, and the distant, snow-capped ribs of the mountains vanished behind a terrifying, rapidly approaching wall of moving dust and sand. "Not good," Bo said, his calm instantly shifting to focused command. "First sandstorm of the season. We won't outrun it to town. My little cabin is closer, the one they used for the line riders, before Graves took the water." Cora nodded, understanding the urgency. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a blinding, grinding hell of wind and particulate matter. Bo guided them, Justice leading Cora's mare through the terrifying gloom, the dust coating everything, making breathing painful. They finally reached the shelter, a small, solid cabin built into the lee of a rocky outcrop, abandoned but still structurally sound. Cora's mother, who had been waiting anxiously at the beehives, was already hurried inside by Bo, who had spotted her distress just before the storm hit full force. The night was dominated by the furious drumming of sand against the cabin's thick walls and the high, desperate howling of the wind trying to rip the roof off. Inside, the three of them sat by a meager fire kindled in the stone hearth, the tiny cabin creaking and moaning like a ship fighting a gale. Amelia Whitlock, Cora's mother, was bundled in a heavy woolen blanket, shivering from fear and weakness. Cora forced her to drink weak tea, then sat back, listening to the violent argument of the storm outside. The noise was maddening, isolating them in a small, desperate circle of firelight. "It's the worst kind of prison, this sound," Cora whispered, mostly to herself, staring into the heart of the flame. "It makes everything outside feel impossible. It just makes everything outside feel far away," Bo countered, his voice steady. He was sitting across the small room, his back against the wall, his rifle laid casually across his lap. He seemed utterly unconcerned with the storm, his composure a rock against the chaos. "I'm afraid, Bo," Cora admitted quietly. The intimacy of the shared space and the extreme isolation of the storm made the truth easier to speak. Not of the storm, of failing my mother, of failing those children. I keep thinking, if I had just ridden faster that day, if I had gotten to my father sooner." Bo shifted, pulling a piece of dried wood closer to the fire. "That's the worst kind of freight you can haul. Cora, the unnecessary load of guilt. It wasn't your fault." He paused, gathering his thoughts, his gaze drifting from the fire to the rattling rafters. "I know what that load feels like. You asked about my past. When I ran freight years back, south of Cimarron, we were carrying a shipment of rifles, me and 4 others. The information about our route got out. We hit an ambush. I shot my way out, but 3 men didn't make it. I saw how the information leaked, how one of the men sold us out for a promise of gold." He looked at Cora, and his confession was delivered in the same level tone he used to discuss the price of oats, making it profoundly moving. "I wasn't the one who sold the route, but I was the one who saw the betrayal coming and chose to keep quiet until it was too late, thinking it wasn't my place to interfere. That was my failure. I survived, but I watched my friends die because I chose silence over engagement. I chose my own safety over the law of the trail. I kept my mouth shut, and they paid the price. That is why I am quiet now. I chose the silent life, the running of the cattle, the stock of the store. It's been my way of trying to pay for what I didn't say, a passive act of redemption." His confession was a mirror to her fear, an understanding shared across the roaring darkness. Cora realized his quietness was not simply reserve. It was a self-imposed penance, a burden of conscience. The sheer bleakness of their shared truths was momentarily pierced by Cora's sudden, unexpected laugh. Amelia, startled, stirred in her blankets. "What is it?" Bo asked, surprised by the sound. "The coffee," Cora said, wiping a tear of strained exhaustion and humor from her eye. "You made it for breakfast this morning. Before we left, it was so strong, so black, it tasted like Graves' Law brewed in a cup. And you ate those beans you cooked so hard they clinked against my tin plate, like little lead bullets." Bo actually cracked a smile, a rare, handsome sight. Well, I'm good with lead. Miss Whitlock, not so good with beans. Yours was the coffee of the righteous, then bitter and necessary. And yours were the beans of the condemned, Cora retorted, the shared laughter a small, vital fire pushing back against the storm and their collective anxieties. The humor eased the atmosphere, revealing the honest, unvarnished person beneath the cowboy and the beekeeper. As the night wore on, the fire needed tending. Cora began carefully heating a small saucepan. She was making her mother's honey syrup, a thick, dark medicine boiled down from the sweetest comb. The slow, patient work required a low, steady flame. "Smells like a better kind of wealth," Bo murmured, watching the liquid thicken. "It is," Cora agreed. "Patience is the main ingredient. You have to watch it constantly. If the fire is too high, it burns the sugar and the whole batch is ruined bitter and worthless." They watched the small fire together. The image of the fire and the syrup, a tangible symbol of their internal states, a quiet, patient vigil over the thickening sweetness, mirroring the care they were exercising with their own rising feelings. When Amelia finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Cora wrapped the remaining blankets around her. Bo stood, stepping quietly across the cabin floor. He pulled his own heavy wool coat from the peg and gently placed it over Cora's shoulders. He stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of his coat settle around her, before retreating the small distance back to his corner. It was a gesture of deep, respectful affection. He didn't touch her, didn't presume. Under the roar of the sandstorm, the two people had confessed their deepest failings and found solace. And now, they affirmed their commitment to a different, stronger kind of relationship. The feeling between them was tender and profound respect and regard held sway, placed firmly ahead of any instinctive desire or hurried passion. Morning finally broke, a pale, defeated light filtering through the dust-caked window pane. The wind had died, leaving behind a profound silence and a world muted by a thick layer of red powder. The sudden return to quiet was broken by the sound of horse hooves. Sheriff Hollis Vane, a small, sweaty man dressed in a badge that was far too heavy for his character, rode up with two deputies. He was red-eyed and irritable. Vane dismounted, dusting off his coat with frantic, futile gestures. "McAllister, Miss Whitlock, disturbing the peace and breaking the curfew laws. Fry came whining to me. You closed the store early to evade Graves's regulator. You are setting a bad example of civil disobedience and immorality. Hold up out here all night." Bo stepped out, meeting Vane's eye with a cold, level stare. We were in a line cabin. Sheriff, protecting an elderly woman from a dust storm. If that's a crime, you better arrest the entire Wyoming territory. "It's the regulation," Vane whined, puffing out his chest weakly. "And the mercantile is being fined for undercutting the set price on sugar. Graves says it's market manipulation. I'm serving the paper." Vane shoved a crumpled writ into Bo's hand, citing a hefty fine that would wipe out the store's profits for weeks. "Fry is talking about pulling his investment. McAllister, he's scared. And he's right to be. You break the law, you pay the fine." Bo didn't even look at the paper. He tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Fry can worry about his money. I'll worry about the law. I made the sale. I'll pay the fine, but the debt I pay is mine. Sheriff, not the town's, not the old lady's, and certainly not the children's." Vane, satisfied that he had delivered Graves's message and his own petty grievance, sputtered a final warning about morality and rode off with his deputies. Fry did, in fact, try to pull out of the partnership that afternoon, but Bo, his face grim, simply pointed to the deficit entry he had written in the ledger, the one for Cora's sugar, and told Fry, "I took the risk, and I take the fine. The risk is covered. Now you cover your shift." Bo accepted the entire financial burden Graves had imposed, bearing the weight of his moral action alone, but he didn't feel alone. As he looked up, he saw Cora, on her newly returned mare, looking back at him from the road, She nodded a simple, straight-backed acknowledgement. The storm had passed, but the trial had begun. The mercantile's fine had been paid, but the true penalty was now being exacted. Within a week of Sheriff Vane's visit, the small, independent freight line that Beau had contracted with for his goods, the one that snaked around Graves' main toll road, suddenly developed a crippling series of scheduling conflicts. Graves had leaned on the owner, a man whose family relied on Graves's grazing rights, and the man folded instantly. "They won't touch our cargo," Beau, Fry reported, sweat staining his vest. "Not a pound of salt, not a bolt of fabric. We're cut off. Graves is throttling us. Plain and simple. We'll be selling dusty air by next month, and then he buys us out for a handful of copper." Beau stood in the middle of the empty, echoing storeroom. He ran a hand over the rough burlap of the few remaining bags of dried apples. The lack of goods wasn't just a financial problem, it was a matter of community dignity. People depended on the mercantile for necessities that Graves's own subsidized store, the dam supply, sold at predatory prices. "No," Beau said, the words sounding heavy and definitive in the silence. "We are not closing. There is a way around the divide, through the Horseshoe Canyon Pass. It's rough, barely a game trail, and it adds 2 full days to the trip, but it's off Graves's land and out of his sight. I can haul the supply wagon myself." Fry threw his hands up in dismay. "It's a fool's errand. That path is treacherous. Beau, if a wheel breaks, you're done. You can't make that trip alone." Beau ignored the panic, already mapping the route in his head. It was a risky 3-day round trip across punishing terrain. It required a high degree of confidence in his team and his own resourcefulness. When Cora heard about the plan, she rode Justice, the sturdy bay Beau often used for the trail to the mercantile. She found Beau harnessing the largest supply wagon. "You're going alone?" she asked, dismounting with easy grace. "It's the only way to avoid Graves's men," Beau confirmed, securing a heavy chain around the brake lever. "No witnesses, no troubles." Cora walked up to the wagon bed, looking over the array of ropes, blankets, and tools. "You need a second pair of eyes. Mr. McAllister, and another rifle." Beau straightened, his eyebrows raising slightly in surprise. "It's no place for a woman. Miss Whitlock, the pass is high, cold, and there's no room for error." "I've lived in this territory my entire life." "Sir," Cora retorted, folding her arms, "I understand error, and I understand necessity. I need to ride to the North Fork to check my distant hives anyway, the ones near the old stage route. It's not far off your path. Besides," she leaned in, a sly, humorous light in her eyes, "I can be useful. I hear the only thing you cook worse than beans is coffee, and I need a favor in return." "A favor?" Beau asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in his steady voice. Cora pointed a finger toward Justice. The bay Beau was preparing. "I want to learn how to properly gentle a spoiled horse. My mare, Daisy, she's a good girl, but she's got a stubborn streak that would shame a mule. You teach me how to guide her reins, how to read her mood, and I'll come along. Consider it half my payment for the 5 pounds of sugar." Beau watched her, measuring the determination in her stance against the reality of the danger. He saw the fire in her, the same kind of discipline she applied to her bees, a willingness to face a challenge head-on. She wasn't seeking excitement, she was offering partnership. A slow smile spread across his face. "Deal, Miss Whitlock. But if the going gets rough, you follow every order I give. Without argument, I'm responsible for your mother and the continuation of the sweetest damn schoolroom in the territory." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Cora agreed. "I only follow the steady hand." The journey began before dawn. The light was pale and blue, and the air was crisp with the promise of a cold day. Cora rode Daisy, her small saddlebags packed with coffee, honey, and her drawing materials. Beau guiding the heavy freight wagon with Justice leading the team. The trail through the Horseshoe Canyon Pass was every bit as demanding as Beau had promised. It was a relentless climb, the path strewn with loose shale and crisscrossed by dry washouts. Beau drove the wagon with an intense, quiet skill, knowing the weight and balance of his load intimately, coaxing the team over obstacles with soft words and firm guidance. Cora watched him, realizing that his calmness wasn't apathy, but a deep, ingrained control. He never rushed, never wasted energy, just moved forward with an unyielding purpose. By the second afternoon, having reached the highest, most exposed point of the pass, the weather turned treacherous. A low-hanging storm front, dark as slate, rolled in without warning, unleashing a sudden, furious barrage of hail hard, marble-sized chunks of ice that battered the wagon and stung the skin. Down into the crack, Bo yelled, pointing toward a deep fissure in the rocky wall. They scrambled, pulling the horses and the wagon team into the narrow, sheltered space between two massive granite faces. The hail hammered the rock above them with a deafening rattle. They were jammed shoulder to shoulder in the small, dry space, the air instantly cooling to an icy dampness. Cora leaned back against the rough, cold stone, breathing heavily, the adrenaline finally receding. Bo stood pressed against her side, using his broad frame to shield her and the horses' heads from the stray ice that bounced into the fissure. The closeness was unavoidable. The scent of his worn leather, the damp wool of his shirt, the steady sound of his breathing right beside her ear. It was a space of shared vulnerability, stripped bare by the sudden fury of nature. The rhythm of the storm was slow now, not the desperate shriek of the sandstorm, but the steady, heavy thrum of rain and the clatter of freezing pellets. It was a deeply sensual experience, though not a passionate one, an awareness of their bodies as warm, living things pressed against the cold. Dead rock. "We'll hold here until the rain passes," Bo murmured, his voice a vibration near her ear. "This crack is deep enough to keep us dry." "It's safe," Cora agreed, shivering slightly as the dampness seeped in. "And quiet. You can hear yourself think, or remember." Bo shifted slightly, making more room for her, and she felt the tension ease from his muscles. In the intimate confinement, surrounded by the drumming rain, the quiet man began to speak again. "I told you about the ambush at Cimarron," Bo started, his voice barely audible over the rain. "What I didn't tell you, I didn't just choose silence. The moment the firing started, I had to choose who to save." He paused, gathering his enormous reserve of control. "The man who sold us out, his family was with him. His wife and a child, a boy, no older than 7. The attackers were ruthless. They would have killed them all to silence the witness." Bo's hands, resting on the hilt of the skinning knife tucked into his belt, tightened. "I pulled the boy off the wagon just before it went up in flames. I got him away. But in the fire and the confusion, 3 of my friends died. The man who sold us out, he died too, shot by his own associates. The boy survived. His name was Paul. He's alive now, with his aunt in Santa Fe." "You saved him," Cora whispered. "I saved a life, but I was responsible for my friend's safety." "They died because I wasn't faster to expose the rot," Bo corrected, his voice rough with old guilt. "I didn't want to be a hero. Cora, I didn't want the recognition. All I wanted was to stop the rot from spreading again. I chose silence and anonymity, hoping the lack of attention would keep me clean. But it just felt like choosing the easy way out, choosing to let someone else carry the fight. It felt like I was running from the consequences of my own necessary violence." His confession was the key to his soul, a man terrified of the hero's mantle, because he believed the role was inherently corrupting, choosing the anonymous burden of silence as a form of moral penance. Cora reached out, her hand finding his large, rough one in the darkness. She squeezed once, fiercely, before withdrawing. "My father," she said, her own voice steadying. "When he went down to the dam, I was supposed to have told him about the watchman's shift change. He thought he had another hour. I was distracted, checking the hives, trying to figure out a fungus. I was late telling him. He went down there, thinking he had time, and Graves' man was already there. He died alone. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. I've carried that bow, that if I had just been faster. I built my life on the idea of perfect timing and control, because of that single, terrible delay. But what I'm learning from you, and from the storm, and from the bees, is that we can only control our intention, not the outcome. You saved a boy's life, and you took on the burden of 3 deaths. I loved my father, and I was late. Neither of those things were our fault. Bo, we have to learn to say that out loud. It wasn't my fault. The two of them sat in the small, cold space, having confessed their ghosts to one another. The secrets that had defined their lives were now shared, sealed by the drumming rain and the close proximity. Trust, in that moment, was forged deeper than any wedding band. The tension broke with a sudden, delightful bit of levity. "All right, now that the dark confessions are out," Cora said, her voice lightened by the release. "Let's talk horsemanship. I think you are secretly a far worse rider than I am." Bo scoffed, genuinely amused. "I've been on horseback since I could walk. Miss Whitlock, I hauled freight across 3 territories. I know more about horses than you do about drones." "Nonsense! You ride too heavy," Cora argued. "You don't guide justice, you command him. Daisy, my mare, she's flighty, yes, but she's also sensitive. When I try to turn her right, she veers left. It's like she's fighting me just for the sake of the fight." "She's not fighting you," Bo explained patiently, leaning close to point out the details on his bridle. "She's testing you. You're giving her too much rein, too much slack. You have to tell her firmly where she's going, not ask her with polite suggestion. She's smarter than you think. Now, if you can get Daisy to take a straight line down this pass tomorrow without fighting the bit, I will let you set the price of the candy in the store for a full month. All the children get to pay the honey price, not the Graves' price." Cora grinned, a wide, genuine, victorious smile. "Done. And if I fail, I have to eat those bullet beans you cooked." The next morning, the air was clean and cold. As they started the descent, Bo took Cora to a wide, dry creek bed, a dangerous place in a flood, but now a training ground. He had her ride Daisy in small, tight circles, teaching her the subtle pressure of the knee, the precise, minimal tension on the reins. It was a lesson in firm, gentle guidance, a philosophy of control that applied equally to the horse, the mercantile, and a budding partnership. As they rode further down, into the scrub oak, Cora spotted something unusual, a series of freshly chiseled marks on a massive limestone rock near the stream bed, carefully lined up with a crude wooden post driven into the earth nearby. "What is that?" Cora asked, dismounting and walking toward the stream. Bo dismounted too, his eyes narrowing. The stream bed here was unnaturally dry for the season. The post was placed far into the bank, much further than any legal survey marker. "That's a water level mark," Bo said, studying the depth of the cuts in the stone. "They use them to measure the cubic feet of flow, but this post is placed too high. And look at the marks. They don't match the official gauge at the dam." Cora knelt, running her finger over the chalk lines. "No, they don't. And look here." She pointed to a faint, dark smudge of ink on the face of the post. "That is the precise line, the one that means the water is dangerously high, far past the legal limit for this season. Graves is hoarding water. Bo, he's deliberately widened the base of the dam with an illegal, internal extension represented by this post to hold back more water and starve the downstream farmers." Cora, ever the meticulous keeper of details and the geometry of the hive, pulled out a charcoal pencil and her small sketching pad, working quickly and precisely. She drew a detailed cross-section of the post and the carved lines, showing the distance between the false, publicly known watermark and the true, illegally high level. It was a careful, deliberate process, like an architect drafting the blueprint for a perfect honeycomb cell. "This is the evidence." "Bo!" Cora whispered, her eyes shining with fierce intelligence. This is the proof that Graves is doing more than just charging high fees. He is actively stealing the territory's water supply. They carefully wrapped the drawing in a small piece of oilskin, then tucked it into a small leather pouch. As they did so, their hands met over the pouch, their fingers lingering for a silent moment, a handshake of mutual commitment. "We don't use this yet," Bo stated. His eyes hard and focused. "Pike will be watching the dam, and Vane will seize anything we bring back. We need to get this to the right authority, the circuit judge, far away from Bitter Creek. We fight this where the law is honest, not with a quick draw in the dusty street." "Agreed," Cora said, her gaze meeting his. "Firm and resolute. No shooting first. We use the truth. Bo, the proof is cleaner than lead." They mounted their horses. The load of necessities was secured in the wagon, and the map of Graves's crime was secured in the pouch. They had entered the canyon seeking supplies, but they emerged with a pact, bound not by words but by shared secrets and a commitment to fighting an honest fight. They looked forward, toward the small, distant smudge that was Bitter Creek, knowing the real trial lay ahead. The freight wagon, heavy with necessary supplies, rolled back into Bitter Creek under the pale morning sun. An undeniable victory for the mercantile, but the success was immediately overshadowed by a nasty, calculated twist. A newly posted bill, crudely tacked onto the telegraph pole outside the sheriff's office, stopped the town's foot traffic dead. It was a territory-wide wanted poster, yellowed with age, but still strikingly clear. It offered a significant reward for the capture of a known highwayman, described vaguely as BM, last seen riding with the Cimarron gang. The man was wanted for armed robbery and the murder of 3 freight riders during an ambush some years ago. The resemblance in the sketch was loose. It was a generic portrait of a tall, dark-haired man, but the initials, BM, hit the community with the force of a gunshot. The whisper started instantly, a dry, malevolent rustle that passed through the town like a contagious fever. Bo McAllister, BM. It was the quiet past he had sought to bury, finally clawing its way back into the light, manipulated by the cruel hand of Simeon Graves. Sheriff Hollis Vane, suddenly feeling empowered by the legal cover of an old poster, appeared to play his part. He sidled up to Bo as he was unloading the wagon, his face a mask of false concern. "McAllister, that poster is causing trouble," Vane muttered, adjusting his star nervously. "People are talking. Your reputation, your silence. It's all making them jumpy. I have a duty to keep the peace. Maybe you should spend a night or 2 in the jailhouse, just until I can get a clear description from the territory marshal. For the peace of the town. Bo, for the peace of the town." Vane's intention was not to arrest Bo, but to publicly brand him, to create enough doubt that the community would turn on the man who had dared to sell them sugar at a fair price. Inside the mercantile, Josiah Fry was beside himself, his hands shaking so violently he dropped a tin of coffee beans. "You told me it was a clean past. Bo, you said you only chose silence. Now there's a bounty on your head. I can't. I won't work with a wanted man. Graves will buy the store for 10 cents on the dollar, and I'll be ruined." The community was split down the middle. One half the established merchants, the ranch hands indebted to Graves. The gossips like the widow Hemlock chose to believe the worst. Bo's intense quietness, which had once been interpreted as disciplined reliability, was now seen as the necessary secrecy of an outlaw. He had admitted to being at Cimarron, to shooting his way out. The poster merely confirmed their darkest suspicions. But the other half, the poor ranch families, the children's parents who benefited from Cora's school, the honest artisans like Thomas Thorne the blacksmith remembered Bo's quiet stand. They had seen his decency, his willingness to pay the fine, and his sheer competence in returning with the needed freight. They reserved their judgment, but the seed of distrust had been expertly planted. Cora, however, did not waver. The morning the poster went up, she marched straight to the telegraph office, confirmed the poster's origin and age, and then walked directly to the mercantile. She found Bo in the storage yard, leaning against the returned wagon, silently watching the street. He looked weary, the burden of his past heavier than the flour sack he had carried. Cora approached him, her spine straight. "You told me the truth about Cimarron," she said, her voice firm. "I told you the truth of my conscience. Cora, I didn't tell you every detail of the ambush. I was there. I fired my weapon. I left the territory quickly. It's enough for Graves to turn a sketch into a conviction. Then we use my truth to fight their lie," Cora declared. She paused, then, with a flourish, pulled a small, worn, cloth-bound notebook from her pocket. It was her bee journal, filled with detailed observations, dates, and times. She walked directly to the sheriff's office, Bo following her, silent but watchful. Vane was sitting at his desk, polishing his badge and looking far too important. "Sheriff Vane," Cora announced, laying the open journal down on his desk, her finger pointing to a precise date. "The poster claims B.M. was involved in a robbery 260 miles south of here on the night of October 17th, 3 years ago. Bo McAllister was indeed near the location, but I can prove his movements for every hour of that week." Vane scowled. "Prove it with what? Woman gossip?" "With the witness of my honest industry," Cora said, her voice ringing with confident humor. "This is the log of my hives. On the day in question, Mr. McAllister was assisting me with a difficult queen relocation just south of my cabin. The date is here, October 17th, 3 years ago. Time 2 hours past noon, until well after sunset." She leaned over the desk, presenting the meticulous entry. "Mr. McAllister, a man who chose quiet over public attention, spent that afternoon with me, helping me move the queen to the new hiving box. It was a 2-man job. He couldn't have been 260 miles away robbing a wagon. Sir, unless he can ride faster than a telegram, my bees are my witnesses. Sheriff, they work on a schedule. They testify, sir, that Bo McAllister was doing honest, tedious labor on that date, not highway robbery." The sight of the neat, authoritative handwriting, the precise detail of the beekeeper's log, and the sheer audacity of citing insects as defense witnesses stunned Vane. The claim was ridiculous, yet delivered with such conviction and backed by physical documentation, a journal clearly written over years, that it momentarily neutralized the poster's power. It was a display of intellectual wit against brute slander. Vane stammered. "A bee journal." "This is nonsense. I still have to confirm the identity." But the public defense had worked. Cora had publicly placed her spotless reputation next to Bo's shadowy one, forcing the town to choose between the integrity of the beekeeper and the manipulation of the sheriff. The very next day, Graves escalated his attack. He knew the evidence Cora and Bo had found in the canyon, the illicit watermark, was too dangerous to ignore. He had to separate them. Calder Pike, Graves's enforcer, intercepted Cora in the market square. Graves wants to talk settlement, honeypot, about the land, and the water fees. You come to the dam office now, alone. Cora knew it was a trap, but she was worried that Bo's presence would provoke a shooting match, giving Vane the excuse he needed to finally jail Bo, using the wanted poster. "I will come," she said, her expression grim, "but I will be armed with my account book. Everything stays in the light." Pike. At the small, fortified wooden office near the Bitter Dam, Pike allowed Cora inside and quickly slammed the heavy, bolted door. There was no desk, no paperwork, only the damp, cold smell of concrete and a single kerosene lantern burning low. Pike stood between her and the door. "No settlement, Miss Whitlock. Just a final warning. Graves wants that sketch you made of the watermarks, and he wants you to drop the claim against McAllister. You leave him, you sell the land, or you'll find that straight back of yours is going to get very tired." He advanced, his presence intimidating and menacing. Cora, clutching her account book like a shield, kept backing away. She knew she could not physically fight him, but she also remembered her principle: keep a straight back. She needed a weapon of distraction. She glanced up. The room, designed for cold weather, had a thick stone chimney and hearth. A rusty, neglected stovepipe ran up the wall. Graves should choose his enforcers better, Cora said, keeping her voice light and conversational, trying to hold his attention. You're too loud. Pike, too predictable. Pike sneered and moved closer. Cora used the moment. She seized the old, corroded stovepipe, yanking at it with all her strength. The pipe, half-eaten by rust, tore away from the wall, a thick, choking cloud of black. Powdery chimney soot and ash instantly erupted into the small, confined space. Pike roared in surprise and blinding pain as the caustic cloud enveloped him. Cora didn't wait, blinded and coughing. She spun around and clawed her way to the small, grimy window high above the counter. It was locked from the outside, but the aged wooden frame was weak. She kicked the glass out with the heel of her boot, tearing away the sharp edges of the remaining frame. The room was pitch black with the smoke, and Pike was cursing, staggering, and rubbing his burning eyes. Cora launched herself through the narrow opening, scrambling onto the sloping roof of the small porch, her hands scraped and raw. She was struggling to keep her balance on the corrugated tin roof when a low voice reached her from below. Hold still, Cora. Bo had arrived on Justice, his face grim. He had seen Pike ride out and knew the trap was inevitable. He had raced back, finding the dam office locked and silent. He dismounted, holding his arms up. Jump, I'll catch you. Cora slid off the edge of the porch roof. Bo caught her neatly, cradling her briefly before setting her gently on her feet. She was shaking, covered in soot, but unharmed. He immediately saw the fresh, raw bruises ringing her wrists, the pressure marks from Pike's massive hands when he had grabbed her and backed her against the wall before the smoke diversion. Bo's composure shattered. The sight of the marks, the silent testimony of the violence she had just escaped, unleashed a storm inside him, far worse than any desert gale. His eyes went flat and dangerous, reflecting a primal, uncontrolled anger. The muscle in his jaw worked furiously. For a terrible moment, Cora thought he was going to turn and kick down the door, letting the gunslinger in him finally take over. Pike finally stumbled out the door, soot-blackened and hacking, ready to fight. Bo did not draw his weapon. He simply fixed Pike with a look that promised a future reckoning far colder and more brutal than a quick shooting. Pike, Bo said, his voice a quiet rasp. You touch her again. You look at her wrong. You speak her name out of turn, and I swear on every name I lost at Cimarron. I will not wait for the law. That is a promise. Pike. Seeing the controlled fury in Bo's eyes, the quiet man finally showing his capacity for absolute violence, actually hesitated, backing up a step. The warning was clear and absolute. Bo turned his back on Pike, putting himself firmly between the enforcer and Cora. He gently took her scraped hands in his own, his thumb tracing the painful bruises on her wrists. They will not touch you again, Bo stated, his voice a low, fierce vow. I promise you that. Cora. The incident forced a tactical retreat. Cora knew she could not leave her mother alone, and Bo could not leave the mercantile unmanned. That afternoon, she and Bo worked silently together, dismantling her hives. They didn't retreat from beekeeping, but physically relocated the entire operation to a more defensible spot, a thick stand of willows near the banks of the Bitter Creek, closer to town. The move was symbolic. She was moving closer to the source of life, closer to the community, and closer to Bo's protection. The bees and the honey were her source of income and her dignity, and even though Graves was hoarding the water, she was asserting her right to thrive on the remaining moisture. The bees, she knew, would find a way, just as she would. Bo's internal struggle was immense. His promise to himself never to fire first, never to rush to the violence that had cost him his old life, was tested to its absolute breaking point by Pike's assault on Cora. His rage warred with his resolve. The maturity of his growth wasn't about eliminating the anger. It was about choosing the battleground. He knew that shooting Pike would mean his own immediate arrest under the false poster, handing Graves a total victory. He had to keep his hands clean for the legal fight, for the use of the map evidence they had risked everything for. The community had reached a critical fissure. A few more families, panicked by Graves' latest threats and the sudden appearance of the wanted poster, caved, selling their water rights to Graves at a pittance. But more importantly, the core of honest people who had witnessed Cora's bravery and Beau's controlled reaction began to shift their loyalty. The widow Hemlock, seeing Cora's bruises, finally turned her back on Graves' gossip and started secretly supplying Cora's mother with milk. The fight was turning from a silent economic struggle into an open question of integrity. And for a few decent souls, the quiet sweetness of Cora and Beau was beginning to outweigh the bitter, armed power of Graves. Graves, thwarted by Cora's successful escape and the public exposure of his foreman's brutality, changed his strategy from intimidation to mass destruction. He aimed to turn the fragile community trust back into fear and suspicion. It happened just after midnight. A sudden, violent orange glow burst across the northern sky, illuminating the familiar silhouette of the town against the black plateau. It was the grain storage shed, owned by Thomas Thorne, the blacksmith, and used by several independent ranchers to hold their meager winter feed. That was ablaze. Beau and Cora, who had been discussing the logistics of sending their map to the circuit judge, heard the frantic cries immediately. Beau was already saddling Justice when Cora emerged from her cabin, her hair braided tight. "Pike's work," Beau stated grimly, his face illuminated by the distant flames. "He'll try to blame the school stove, or a candle left burning in your cabin. He wants to wipe out the small farmer's supplies." They rode hard toward the fire, the heat already radiating in the chill night air. The blacksmith, Thomas Thorne, stood helplessly watching his winter livelihood roar toward the sky, his massive hands clenched into useless fists. "We can't save the shed," Thorne yelled over the crackle, "but the fire's jumping the gap. It's going to hit the feed store next, and then the whole street." The danger was immediate. The adjacent building, a small, wood-framed structure, was already smoking. Beau, decisive and calm under pressure, immediately took command. "Thorne, get every bucket and tin you can find. We need a human chain from the nearest well. Cora, the roof, quickly." Cora didn't hesitate. She grabbed a ladder and clambered onto the adjacent smoking roof with Beau right behind her. They led a rapidly forming line of townspeople. Fry even showed up, fear giving way to necessity, passing buckets of well water that evaporated instantly on the hot shingles. It was a desperate, losing fight against the roaring inferno of the grain shed itself. "We need something to smother this heat," Beau shouted, beating back the flames with a wet blanket. Cora, momentarily descending to grab more water, had a sudden, desperate inspiration. She raced back to the mercantile wagon and pulled out the large sack of sugar she had purchased, along with several jars of her darkest, thickest honey. "The preservation syrup," Cora shouted to Beau. "The sugar and honey, the boiling syrup is thick, sticky. We can use it to coat the hot seams and slow the spread." It was an act of profound sacrifice. The sugar, bought through risk and fine, was a finite resource meant for the children's education and her mother's medicine. Now, she was offering it up to save a blacksmith's store. They worked together. Cora rapidly boiling the sugar and honey with water in a large iron pot they salvaged from the boarding house kitchen. Beau coating the vulnerable wooden seams of the adjacent building with a thick, sticky, scorching hot syrup. The substance, when applied, created a dense, fire-resistant layer that adhered stubbornly to the wood. There, Cora gasped, panting as she pushed the heavy pot toward him. "Sugar's used for everything in the West. Isn't it even fireproofing?" Beau cracked a smile, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Well, if you must sacrifice the sweetness, this is a fine way to do it. It's still sweet enough. Miss Whitlock." The combination of the water chain and Cora's sticky sealant held. The grain shed burned to the ground. A total loss, but the fire was stopped. The adjacent feed store spared. As the sun began to rise, bathing the smoking ruins in a cold, unforgiving light, Bo, exhausted, leaned against the saved building, watching the wagons of Graves's men arriving to offer assistance and survey the damage. In the confusion and the chaos of the night, Bo had noticed something crucial. While the town worked feverishly on the main street, he saw a dusty, unmarked wagon, one he recognized from Graves's remote property, sneaking away, hauling water drums back toward the dam. Graves hadn't been interested in the fire. He had been using the distraction to illegally move more water to his private reservoirs before the sun exposed the low creek level. Bo straightened up and walked straight to Thomas Thorne, the blacksmith. "Thomas," Bo said, his voice low and urgent. "They didn't just burn your grain. They moved water during the fire. They are stealing the last of the flow. I need you to do something for me that's not fire-related. I need a bucket of heavy, black roof tar, quickly." Within the hour, while the rest of the town surveyed the charred wreckage, Bo and Thorne were back on the road toward Graves's main ranch, taking the same discreet back route Bo had used for the freight. They located the deep tracks of the water wagon Bo had seen. Using a long stick, Bo carefully dipped it into the thick, dark roofing tar. He then marked the inner rim of the wagon wheel tracks with small, distinctive dashes of black tar. The tar would remain sticky and identifiable for days, clinging to the wheels and the axle. It was the second piece of the puzzle, proof that Graves's men were actively engaged in theft and malfeasance, using the community's tragedy as a cover. Later that morning, the exhaustion of the night finally hit. Cora found Bo in the back of the mercantile, too tired to even clean the soot from his hands. He was slumped on a stool, staring blankly ahead. She brought him a mug of strong, bitter coffee, the kind he liked, and a clean towel. She gently began wiping the soot and sweat from his face and neck. The soft intimacy of the gesture, performed in the privacy of the cool storeroom, felt like the culmination of everything they had shared. Cora was shivering, the aftermath of the intense heat and the early morning chill setting deep into her bones. Bo noticed. He reached out and wrapped his large, soot-covered coat around her, pulling her close, resting her cheek against the solid, comforting muscle of his shoulder. He didn't seek anything more than warmth and shared survival. It was a shelter, a safe harbor against the harshness of the world and the dangers of their fight. His chin rested lightly against the top of her head. "You ran toward the fire, Cora," Bo murmured, his voice heavy with fatigue and emotion. "You saved the town's winter stores with sugar. You took something precious and sacrificed it for necessity. You are the finest woman I have ever known." Cora leaned into the strength of his embrace, closing her eyes. "And you, Bo," she whispered back. "You stood in the fire, not with a gun, but with tar and water, fighting their brutality with honesty. You keep the sweetness in this bitter place. That is what I love." The words hung in the air, simple, absolute, and true. They had openly admitted their love not in a moment of candlelit drama, but in the gritty, exhausted aftermath of a battle fought and won. Bo pulled back slightly, his eyes holding hers with deep seriousness. "I love the way you make a bitter town sweet, Cora. And I love the way you keep the sweetness safe, Bo," she responded. They understood the terms of their affection immediately. This love was tied to their shared commitment to justice and dignity. They were building something real, not something quick. They had survived violence and fire. They would not cheapen their bond with hurried passion. Their love was tethered to responsibility. "We need the proof." "Bo," Cora said, her voice firm, even as she clung to the comfort of his coat. "The watermark sketch, the bee journal, the tar marks. We need to get all the evidence secured with someone who won't be bought or intimidated." Bo nodded. "The priest, Father Aloysius, he holds no land, owes no debt. and Graves won't dare touch a holy man's property. He can seal the documents in the church safe. They spent the afternoon meticulously compiling their evidence. Cora's drawing of the illegal dam mark was folded neatly, accompanied by her logbook entry detailing the hour-by-hour flow of the creek. Bo added a note detailing the tire marks he had tarred. They sealed the package with wax and took it to Father Aloysius, who, without asking for details, quietly locked it away, a silent witness to their necessary fight. As the sun began to set, painting the rebuilt town in shades of dusty rose and gold, Bo found Cora standing by the newly relocated beehives. The bees were settling in, busy and industrious, their buzzing a comforting, persistent sound. He stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "We have done all we can do now. The truth is secured. The fight is coming." He turned her to face him, his eyes grave and honest. "After the trial, when Graves is dealt with and the law is settled, I will ask you a question. I will ask you to be my wife. Cora Whitlock, if you will still want to listen." Cora didn't hesitate. She smiled, a radiant, utterly sincere smile that promised the future. "I will listen, Bo McAllister," she answered, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I will listen, if you still want to speak." The world paused on that honest vow. Their love, born of sugar and fire, was now waiting, sealed by a shared promise of justice. The time for fighting with fire and tar was over. The time for the final, honest reckoning was about to begin. The rain arrived not as a gentle blessing, but as a meteorological disaster. It was the heavy, relentless pour of a sudden early winter squall, and it hit the Bitter Creek area with the weight of a natural catastrophe. For the previous 2 weeks, Graves had been hoarding water, anticipating a dry season and planning to sell off his huge private reserves at obscene prices. Now, the dam, engineered to Graves's maximum capacity rather than the necessary safety margins, was dangerously overstressed. Cora was at the new hive location near the willows, working with the persistent diligence of her bees, trying to secure the frames against the sudden downpour. The sky was the color of bruised plums, and the creek, usually a thin, sulky line of water, was swelling rapidly. Then she heard a sound that was not the natural rumble of floodwater, nor the noise of the rain, but a deep, vibrating groan coming from the concrete heart of the bitter dam. It was the sound of material under impossible duress, the earth around the structure singing with strain. She dropped her tools and ran to the bank, looking upstream. The dam wall looked solid, but the turbulence at the base was violent, churning the water into a muddy froth. More alarmingly, the side sluice gates, the ones designed for controlled overflow, were shuddering violently. Cora realized the terrifying calculation: the sluice was already holding maximum legal water, but the sudden rain was pushing it past the breaking point. Before she could process the danger, she saw movement at the dam crest. Calder Pike and 2 of Graves's hired hands were rapidly working on the main overflow valve, not to stabilize the dam, but to open it fully and deliberately. Pike intended to release a catastrophic, controlled flood, a manufactured disaster that would wipe out the remaining independent homes, including Cora's cabin and her new hive location near the creek, forcing the owners to sell the resulting worthless land to Graves. "They're going to empty it all at once!" Cora screamed, her voice lost in the rain. She scrambled onto Daisy, her mare, and rode back toward the mercantile and the few scattered ranch homes, her mind racing. The water would hit in less than half an hour. She found Bo in the mercantile, showing Thorne the blacksmith the exact location of the illegal watermark on her sketch. The dam is groaning. Pike is opening the overflow to scour the creek. Cora burst into the store, rain-soaked and panting, her urgency silencing the small group. Bo didn't waste a second on disbelief. He looked at the sketch one last time, nodding grimly at the dangerously high water line Cora had drawn. "We have 2 minutes for talk. Cora, then action," Bo stated. his eyes blazing with the controlled energy of a man who knows exactly what to do when violence, both human and natural, strikes. He laid out a two-pronged plan, assigning tasks with military precision. Thorn, you and your men know the secondary overflow valves near the south ridge, the ones Graves tries to hide. Get up there, use your iron bars as leverage, and open those emergency drains slowly, under control. If we can divert just enough water, it will stabilize the structure, but not flood the town. We open them one turn at a time. No heroics, just engineering. Thorn, the big blacksmith, nodded, his face determined. We'll use the iron to fight his concrete. Bo, go. Bo turned to Cora. Your job is more dangerous. Pike's rush of water is designed to take out the bottomland and the livestock. You know the creek better than any of us. Take the few farmers who can still ride. Get the remaining cattle and horses out of the flood path. Move them toward the high north scrub. We need to save the living things. Cora. Cora grabbed her oilskin coat and a coil of rope. I'll move them, but you watch your back. Bo, Pike won't let you touch his valves. I gave my word no shooting first, Bo reminded her, giving her a brief, hard look of commitment. I'm using my strength, not my gun. Now go. The two groups split, riding hard into the deluge. Cora led a small, desperate posse of 3 farmers, urging their frightened livestock higher, racing against the roaring clock of the impending flood. Bo, Thorn, and 2 other men rode toward the massive wall of the dam. As they reached the concrete crest, Bo saw Pike and his men using a motorized winch, designed for heavy lifting, to crank the primary sluice gate open fully. Pike, stop that winch, Bo shouted over the wind. You'll take out the entire valley. Pike sneered, his face slick with rain. Graves' orders, the dam's going. McAllister, better a fast, clean wipeout than a slow erosion, and once your little whore's land is under 6 feet of muck, Graves will own the whole damn creek. Bo leaped from his horse, charging toward Pike. Pike dropped the winch handle and reached for a heavy steel crowbar, the same kind Thorn used, intending to use it as a weapon. The fight was brutal, fueled by necessity, and contained by Bo's absolute resolve not to draw his revolver. It was a man-to-man brawl, fought on the wet, slippery concrete of the dam crest. Pike swung the heavy crowbar. Bo ducked, using the momentum of the swing to lock his arms around Pike's massive body. They wrestled, slipping in the rain, the roar of the water beneath them a constant, terrifying soundtrack. Bo fought with disciplined strength, using his weight and the techniques learned on the freight trail to neutralize Pike's brute force. He managed to twist the crowbar away, tossing it into the rushing overflow. Pike, enraged, lunged forward, grabbing the thick, wet winch rope and attempting to wrap it around Bo's throat. Bo drove his shoulder hard into Pike's chest, the impact knocking the foreman backward. Pike stumbled, losing his footing on the treacherous, algae-slick concrete near the edge of the secondary spillway. He screamed, his arms windmilling uselessly, and began to slide toward the boiling water below. Without a second thought, driven by the same instinct that made him save the child at Cimarron, Bo reached out. He grabbed Pike's wrist just as the foreman's feet slipped over the edge. Bo braced himself, his muscles screaming against the weight of the man and the sheer pull of gravity. He struggled, dragging Pike's massive, flailing body back toward the safety of the main dam wall. Pike, coughing and terrified, finally found purchase and collapsed onto the wet concrete. Bo stood over him, breathing heavily. He had refused to let Pike drown, refusing to commit murder even in the heat of self-defense. "Get off this dam, Pike," Bo commanded, his voice shaking with exertion. "And thank the devil I value my own conscience more than I value your life." Meanwhile, Thorn and his men had successfully used their crowbars to slowly crank open the 2 auxiliary drain valves. The high-pressure water began to surge through the new openings, relieving the intense pressure on the main sluice. The earth's groaning eased, and the terrifying vibration of the dam structure began to subside. the immediate threat of a catastrophic dam collapse was averted. But the slow, controlled release of water had another, more critical effect. As the water level receded slightly, stabilizing the flow to a manageable, if still rapid, surge, it exposed the dam's deepest secret. Right along the wet, muddy bank, running up the rock face that formed the natural boundary of the dam, a series of unauthorized rock carvings and wooden markers were now fully visible. This was the precise location Cora had sketched in the canyon. The public saw, for the first time, the evidence of Graves's illegal construction, a false bottom that allowed him to hoard nearly 30% more water than his legal allocation, starving the lower ranches. The cheating was literally exposed to the light of day. A crowd of farmers and townsfolk who had rushed to the dam upon hearing the alarm witnessed the damning evidence, the sight of the exposed, illicit watermarks, perfectly matching the rumors, turned their remaining suspicion into cold, hard certainty. Graves was not just overcharging. He was intentionally stealing their water and nearly killed them all in a greedy, callous attempt to ruin them. Just as the cheers of the grateful town began to rise, Sheriff Vane arrived with his deputies, soaking wet and utterly confused. He saw Bo standing over the defeated Pike, and, determined to earn Graves's favor, he drew his pistol. "Bo McAllister, you are under arrest," Vane shouted, trying to sound authoritative over the remaining rush of water. "Assaulting a man, tampering with the territory's infrastructure. I warned you about disturbing the peace." Vane was attempting a final, desperate inversion of justice, turning Bo's act of saving the dam into a crime. But before Vane could take another step, Father Aloysius, the old priest, walked forward from the crowd. He was carrying a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle, the evidence Bo and Cora had sealed with him. "Sheriff Vane," the priest said, his voice quiet but commanding the immediate attention of the crowd. "The peace has been disturbed. Yes, but not by Mr. McAllister." The priest held up the bundle. "This envelope, sealed in the church safe, contains Miss Whitlock's personal notes on the creek flow, and a map of exactly the illegal marks you can all now see." He gestured toward the newly exposed wall. "It also contains a final statement from Miss Whitlock, notarized with my clerical seal, detailing her hourly observations and, most crucially, a timeline of her family's relationship with the water rights." The crowd murmured, their focus shifting from Vane's misplaced badge to the weight of the religious man's honesty. Just then, a pale, nervous man in a filthy oilskin coat, one of the maintenance workers who had been operating the winch for Pike, stepped forward. "It's true," the man cried, his voice breaking. "Graves had us rebuild the core. He offered bonuses for working late, but he fined us if we opened the valves when the water got too high. He kept the threat of the fine over us, making us choose the fine over the safety of the valley. He's been threatening my family's food supply." The man, defeated by the fear of being swept away and the sight of the exposed corruption, chose honesty. "I'm done. Sheriff, I'm with the people." The worker's confession, combined with the visible proof and the sealed evidence, was the final, undeniable blow to Graves's control. Vane's attempt to arrest Bo crumbled. The sheriff was exposed as Graves's pawn, a man whose badge was merely a tool for economic terror. The dam was safe, the water now diverted and flowing at a manageable rate through the secondary valves. Graves's elaborate plan to ruin the farmers and buy up their land for pennies had failed. He was defeated not by a shootout, but by the exposed truth. Pike, seeing the tide turn and knowing the consequences of his actions, scrambled away, disappearing into the woods. Graves himself, having received the frantic news of the disaster averted and the evidence exposed, was nowhere to be found in town. He had retreated hastily to his heavily fortified ranch house miles outside Bitter Creek, surrounded by his remaining armed employees. The battle for the dam was over, but the final, legal showdown was now relocated to the dusty, anxious streets of the town. Simeon Graves, humiliated by the failure at the dam and aware that the confession of his employee, along with the physical evidence of the illegal watermarks, spelled ruin, retreated to his fortified compound outside of Bitter Creek. He wasn't planning a quiet surrender. He immediately poured all his remaining cash into hiring a small army of armed hands, mostly restless gunmen and ex-miners who valued pay over conscience. He ordered them to erect quick defensive barriers around his sprawling ranch house, turning it into a temporary fortress. Graves' final act of desperation was targeted directly at the two people who had undone him. A detachment of his armed men rode into the town that same evening, under cover of the lingering rain. Their objective was simple: capture Cora Whitlock and any associates, using them as bargaining chips to force the retrieval of the sealed evidence from the priest and ensure Vane kept silent. But the community that had emerged from the fire and the flood was no longer the collection of scared, debt-ridden individuals Graves had long controlled. The dam crisis had revealed their shared danger and their collective capability. Thomas Thorne, the blacksmith, whose forge had been spared by Cora's sacrifice, organized the perimeter. He was joined by Mrs. Hemlock, the boarding house owner, who had swapped her medicinal chaw for a reliable, if ancient, shotgun. The widow who ran the town's only decent cafe took a position by the water trough, using the darkness and the rain as cover. They were not a trained army. They were neighbors with a clear conscience. They stood guard at the four main roads into town, not to fight, but to watch and warn. They were the moral backbone of Bitter Creek, and they were finally standing straight. Bo McAllister, however, knew that any armed confrontation would be disastrous. Graves's gunmen would love nothing more than a chaotic shootout to cover their escape and smear Bo with the Cimarron wanted poster. Bo's resolve remained absolute. The fight had to remain clean and legal. He dispatched a trusted swift rider, one of the younger men Cora had tutored, carrying a meticulous affidavit, signed and witnessed by the priest, detailing Graves's crimes, and sent him east to the mining camp where the circuit judge was known to be holding court. The judge needed to know he was riding into a town on the brink of civil war, armed with incontrovertible evidence. Meanwhile, Bo gathered the community defense Thorne, the cafe owner, and a few others, and issued his final instruction. We are not looking for a firefight. We are looking for justice. We disarmed the town. He collected all but the most necessary defensive rifles from the perimeter watch, stacking them safely in the mercantile. Graves wants a bloodbath to erase the ledger. We will not give it to him. We reduce the likelihood of accidental killing and show the judge we trust the law, not the bullet. Unfortunately, Graves's men were already moving. The group sent to capture Cora was led by a wiry gunman Bo didn't recognize, and they had managed to slip past the outer perimeter in the thick, wet night. They found Cora at her small cabin, having just settled her mother for the night. The gunmen burst in, rifles raised, terrifying Amelia. The leaders shoved Cora roughly toward the door. "You're coming with us. Honeywoman Graves wants to trade your sweet hide for his future." Cora fought with quiet ferocity, kicking backward, delaying the capture just enough. Amelia, seeing her daughter struggling, let out a heart-wrenching, prolonged cry of distress. Bo, who was checking Thorne's perimeter, heard the frantic, distant sound of Amelia's cry, a sound of deep terror and vulnerability that cut through the drumming rain. He didn't hesitate. He mounted Justice and rode toward the cabin, calling for Thomas Thorne to follow him. When Bo reached the cabin, Cora and the gunmen were just mounting up, dragging Cora onto a spare horse. Bo and Thorne charged the group, but Bo held true to his vow. "No shooting," Bo roared. "Drop her, the judge is coming." The gunmen, surprised by the speed of the intervention and the sight of the huge blacksmith accompanying Bo, scattered, dragging Cora with them toward the fortified ranch. Bo and Thorne pursued them into the night. It was a harrowing, rain-soaked night chase through the sagebrush. Cora, realizing Bo could not risk a shooting, used her own ingenuity. She waited until the chase took them near Graves's main corral, a sprawling pen holding dozens of ranch horses. When they were close enough, Cora launched herself sideways from the horse she was forced to ride, tumbling into the mud near the corral fence. The gunmen stopped to retrieve her. In that brief moment, Cora saw her chance. She scrambled to the heavy wooden gate that secured the main bell rope, a rope that ran from the ranch house to a huge, clanging iron bell used to signal the hired hands. She slashed the thick rope with a small knife she kept in her boot, the one she used for cutting honeycomb, severing it completely. The sudden, chaotic clang of the uncontrolled bell rope whipping up and hitting the metal housing, combined with the presence of Bo and Thorn, startled the corral horses. The entire pen erupted in panic, dozens of heavy horses bucking and whinnying, turning the open space into a scene of wild, thundering confusion. In the ensuing chaos, the gunmen lost their nerve and their formation. Bo charged Justice into the fray, scattering the remaining gunmen, and pulled Cora up behind him, riding back to Thorn. The gunmen, disorganized and now facing two determined men, abandoned the pursuit and fled back to the safety of Graves' house. The small, dark confrontation was over, but it led directly to the final, inevitable confrontation. Cora and Bo, leaving Amelia in the care of Mrs. Hemlock, rode straight to Graves' ranch, arriving just before dawn. Graves stood on the wide, covered veranda of his expensive house, surrounded by his last hired fighters. The makeshift barricades gave the scene a desperate, temporary feel. Bo dismounted alone, walking to the edge of the veranda, his hands open and empty. Cora stood 10 feet behind him, a silent, resolute second. Graves sneered. Holding a rifle loosely in his hands, "You finally brought your fight to my home." McAllister. "Well, here it is. You and your bee-woman, a wanted man and a whore. You won't leave this ranch alive." Bo didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the quiet authority of a verdict already passed. "I didn't bring the fight here. Graves, you brought it to the town when you burned Thorn's grain and nearly cracked the dam. I am here because the war for Bitter Creek is over. You lost the water. You lost the people. And now you have lost the law." "You have nothing," Graves roared. "Your evidence is just a child's drawing, and a fake journal vein will burn it all. You're a failed freight rider. McAllister, I own the rails, I own the land, and I own the damn fear in their eyes." Bo stood firm, unmoving in the face of the rifle. "You can win a battle with fear, Graves, and you can win 1,000 fortunes with greed, but you cannot hold back the current of water, and you cannot hold back the flow of justice. The water always finds its way to the honest land, and it's flowing toward Bitter Creek right now, bringing the circuit judge with it." It was then, in the pregnant silence following Bo's indictment, that the final, decisive element appeared. A young man, pale and shaking Graves' own private accountant, a timid soul named David, walked out of the ranch house's side door, his arms loaded with heavy, leather-bound ledgers and a metal strongbox. David walked directly past Graves, past the hired guns, and deposited the entire load, the true freight ledgers, receipts, and an array of false seals used for Graves' fraudulent water and transport fees, onto the veranda railing, right next to Bo. The accountant had made his own brave choice, seeing the chaos, the fire, the attempted kidnapping, and realizing that Graves was willing to destroy the entire community over a debt he couldn't pay. The young man had decided to save his own soul. The evidence was irrefutable. The internal records showed years of manipulation, usury, and outright fraud on a massive scale. Graves let out a choked sound of pure shock and betrayal. His empire of fear was built on the silence of paper, and now the paper itself was speaking. Graves, in a final, futile gesture of defiance, raised his rifle to shoot the accountant. But Graves did not account for Mrs. Hemlock. The widow Hemlock, who had followed Bo and Thorn on her mule, worried about Cora, emerged silently from the shadowed trees at the side of the yard. She raised her old, heavy double-barrel shotgun and fired a single sharp warning blast directly over Graves's head, peppering the thick imported oak paneling of the veranda with buckshot. The roar of the shotgun was the only necessary force. Graves flinched violently, his rifle falling uselessly to the ground. The hired gunman, seeing their commander buckle and realizing they were defending a fraud, not a cause, quickly dropped their own weapons. The fight went out of them in a single, anticlimactic moment. Bo did not move to retrieve a gun. He simply walked forward, picked up a coil of rope used for securing horses, and methodically tied Graves' hands with the same firm, expert knots he used to secure his freight wagons. The man who had sought to enslave the town with paper and water was now trussed up like a prized bull. Just then, 2 riders arrived, Father Aloysius and Sheriff Vane. Vane, seeing the guns on the ground, the evidence on the railing, and the entire community led by the blacksmith and the widow Hemlock watching him, finally saw the truth of his position. He was utterly defeated, his moral cowardice exposed. Vane looked at the determined faces of the people, at the shame of Graves, and at the quiet, unyielding integrity of Bo McAllister. Slowly, deliberately, and with the utmost finality, Sheriff Hollis Vane removed the 5-pointed star from his vest and dropped it into the priest's outstretched hand. It was a late awakening, but one that made him a critical witness for the coming legal proceedings. The final image of the climax was Graves, bound by the kind of rope he usually sold to honest farmers, loaded onto a simple, humble cart, and escorted back to the town he had tried to destroy. The power of Bitter Creek had shifted, not through bloodshed, but through the patient, honest efforts of a beekeeper, a freight rider, and a town that finally decided to stand together. The final battle would now be fought where it should have been all along, in a makeshift court of law. The arrival of the circuit judge, accompanied by a small escort, transformed the Bitter Creek grain warehouse spared from the fire, thanks to Bo and Cora, into a legitimate, if temporary, court of law. It was a proper, expedient trial, complete with the judge's worn, leather-bound law books and a jury impaneled from the most respected, debt-free residents of the nearest mining settlement. The air inside the warehouse, usually thick with the smell of horse feed, was now charged with the tension of communal justice. The evidence was laid out with stark, brutal clarity. The young accountant, David, testified first, detailing Graves's fraudulent freight and water ledgers. He was followed by the maintenance worker who had confessed at the dam, describing the illegal construction and the fines Graves imposed to keep the water dangerously high. Then came the physical proof, the oilskin packet secured by Father Aloysius. The priest presented the sealed bundle, which included Cora's meticulous bee journal detailing the precise flow of the creek and Bo's accompanying map of the illegal watermarks, which matched the lines the townspeople had witnessed at the dam crest. Sheriff Vane, stripped of his badge but wearing his newfound conscience, provided the final, damning testimony. He recounted Graves' control, the manipulation of the wanted poster, and the direct orders to intimidate Cora and fine the mercantile. His cooperation cemented the case against Graves. The judge, a serious man with a tired but honest face, listened to the testimonies of Thorne, Mrs. Hemlock, and the farmers who had been starved of water. The trial wasn't about the law of the gun. It was about the law of common decency and honest economics. The verdict was swift and decisive. Simeon Graves was found guilty on multiple counts: grand larceny of public water resources, economic coercion, and widespread fraudulent practices detailed in his own ledgers. The sentencing was equally firm: a long term of imprisonment in the territorial penitentiary and full forfeiture of the Bitter Dam control and the Graves mercantile franchise, which was to be sold and its proceeds used for restitution. Crucially, the judge issued several protective injunctions that immediately restored order to Bitter Creek. He ordered the immediate release of water flow back to the legal standards of the territory, ensuring the lower ranches and the creek ecosystem could recover. The mercantile's unjust fines were wiped clean, and Bo was formally cleared of any wrongdoing related to the old, manipulated wanted poster. Vane, given his late but instrumental cooperation, was granted leniency, allowed to return to ranching, a humbled man. With the legal storm past, the community moved rapidly into restoration. The mercantile was reopened, now fully and openly run by Bo McAllister with the support of a newly honest Josiah Fry. selling goods at fair prices. The most tangible sign of restored hope was Cora's project. The judge immediately approved the community fund for the new schoolroom, allocating a portion of the restitution money. In the late afternoon, the town gathered outside the mercantile. Children, their faces bright and smeared, ran everywhere, happily munching on small, dark squares of honeycomb candy. The candy was made by Cora, using the very sugar Bo had sold her at the old, honest price, the same sugar she had sacrificed to save the warehouse from fire. Bo watched the joyful chaos, a deep contentment settling over him. He chuckled, turning to Cora. "That's a sweet reward. Miss Whitlock, the account book says you owe me for half of those sweets." Cora grinned, wiping a smudge of honey from his cheek. "Today's sugar is off the ledger, Mr. McAllister. Today, sweetness is free." Later that evening, after the crowds had thinned and the sun was dipping below the scrub oak horizon, painting the newly flowing Bitter Creek in peaceful gold, Bo took Cora's hand and led her down to the willow bank where she had successfully relocated her hives. The bees were active, buzzing low in the dusk, content with the reliable flow of water. The sound was one of industry and peace, the sonic symbol of a community restored to order. Bo stopped by the water's edge. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring. It was rugged, unadorned, the kind of ring made by a frontier silversmith, strong and honest. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with the sincerity of a man who had finally shed his burdens. He kept his voice low and steady, allowing the quiet power of his emotion to speak for itself. "Cora Whitlock," Bo began, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I am not a man for easy promises. My life has been rough, and I know that the territory will never be easy. I cannot promise you comfort, and I cannot promise you a life without risk, because Graves' kind will always be around." He took a deep breath, the love in his gaze both profound and protective. "But I promised you I wouldn't let them touch you again. I promised to choose the clean fight. I promised to listen to you, and I have kept those promises. I love you. Cora, I love the way you bring dignity to work, and the way you can save a town with sugar and a sharp mind. I promise you this, and only this: I will stand by you in both the sweet and the bitter, and I will never let silence hide a necessary truth again." He opened his hand, presenting the ring. "Will you take the risk on me and be my wife?" Cora's eyes filled not with tears, but with a deep, shining certainty. She saw the man who had faced down fire and brute force with only his courage and his commitment to principle. "I choose the man who keeps the sweetness safe, Bo McAllister," Cora replied, her voice husky with emotion. "I choose the man who chooses the clean hands over the quick gun. Yes, I will be your wife." Bo carefully slipped the silver ring onto her finger. It was a simple, warm kiss they shared then, a solemn, grateful joining of two people who had found love in shared labor and moral necessity. A few ranch hands, returning from the fields, saw the couple by the creek and let out a spontaneous, delighted chorus of whistles and shouted congratulations, the rough, good-natured humor of the Western community. As they walked back toward the lights of town, they knew the final stage of their relationship was built on the foundation they had established. The love they shared was bound to freedom and respect. They would not consummate their relationship until their wedding day, a voluntary choice that underscored the deep reverence and regard they held for one another and the sanctity of their commitment. Their desire was profound, but their mutual respect for boundaries was stronger, mirroring the discipline they applied to their work and their fight. The quiet, industrious sounds of the hives at the creek bank were the final symbol. The bees were dividing their comb, preparing for a new season of honest labor. The Bitter Creek flowed freely and steadily for the first time in years. Nature itself, reflecting the restored moral order, was signaling a future of balance and hope. The autumn sunlight filtered gold and soft through the branches of the ancient willows lining the Bitter Creek, the spot where Cora's bees now thrived. This was the location of the simple, beautiful wedding. There were no imported silks or extravagant flowers. The decor was the land itself, cleaned by the recent rains and graced by the natural bounty of the season. The entire town was their witness and their wedding party. There was no single grand wedding gift. Instead, neighborly affection was their joint dowry. Thomas Thorne brought a massive, perfectly roasted hog. Mrs. Hemlock baked a dozen loaves of fresh milled bread, and every ranch wife contributed a dish chili, pickled vegetables, or dried fruit preserves. The central element, however, was a magnificent, tiered honey cake baked by Cora, sweetened with the contested sugar and the purest harvest of her hives, and served alongside vast pots of strong, black coffee. It was a celebration of victory as much as love. Their new home was built not on a grand estate, but on the small, hard-won parcel of land Cora's father had died trying to protect, right next to the flowing creek. It was a practical homestead. Cora immediately repurposed one side of their small cabin into a clean, sun-drenched schoolroom, right next to her thriving bee garden. The air was filled with the rhythmic sound of her lessons, the earnest, slow reading of the children interspersed with the contented, steady buzzing of the bees. Beau, for his part, had finally returned to his first love freight, but instead of running a risky, private business, he had organized the Bitter Creek Freight Cooperative among the farmers. All profits from hauling goods from the mines and ranches were pooled and shared fairly among the members. The sound of Beau's work now was the steady ringing of Thorne's hammer repairing a wagon, the cheerful rattle of freight bells as the wagons departed, and the low, careful tones of Beau negotiating a fair price for the town's communal goods. Their marriage settled into the hard, honest work of the frontier, tempered by the peace they had earned. The external drama faded, replaced by the deeper, internal markers of their personal growth. Beau, who had spent years hiding his survival guilt under a blanket of silence, found a new purpose for his past. Occasionally, when the children were doing math problems in the schoolroom, he would sit at the back, his powerful frame seeming too large for the small chairs. When asked about his years running the freight lines, he would recount the story of Cimarron, not as a source of shame, but as a lesson. He told them how he had chosen silence because it was easier than confrontation, and how that silence had cost lives. Always choose the right thing over the easy thing. He would instruct the wide-eyed children, "The weight of a quiet conscience is heavier than any load I ever pulled with a wagon." The telling was his final, active act of redemption, transforming his burden into a teaching moment. Cora, too, had shed her self-imposed shackles. She no longer carried the solitary burden of her father's death. She had found leadership in her community and love in partnership. She became a silent anchor for other women who struggled with independence or debt, showing them how to keep their backs straight and their wits sharp, even when facing Graves's returning type, because they both knew that true justice required constant vigilance. That vigilance became institutionalized. In the small, enclosed bulletin board outside the mercantile, Beau ensured the Bitter Creek Irrigation Committee made up of Thorne, the young former accountant, and Cora held regular meetings. The minutes and water usage reports were posted publicly, ensuring that transparency and shared responsibility replaced the opaque tyranny of Graves's regime. Justice was no longer a promise, but a public, verifiable process. Their daily life was a simple, enduring blend of love and laughter. The easy humor they had discovered in the line cabin during the sandstorm became the essential lubricant of their marriage. One morning, Cora teased Beau about his strong, dark brew. "You've put so much coffee into this pot. Beau, I think it might start talking back." "It just needs sweetening," Beau countered, already reaching for the sugar tin. "You've put enough in there already to satisfy a dozen cakes." Cora laughed, grabbing the spoon away playfully. "You're addicted to the sweet now, Mr. McAllister, who won the battle of the sweet and the bitter." Their small, staged arguments often ended the same way. Beau would pull out a small, tattered piece of paper, an old sales receipt from the mercantile, signed by Fry. He would scribble a few words on it. One embrace, paid in full. He would present it to Cora, who would respond with a fierce, simple kiss. The sight of this domestic, loving ritual, the hugging receipt, often drew chuckles and whistles from the customers in the mercantile, cementing their reputation as the humorous, beating heart of the reborn town. 3 powerful symbols defined their lives and the new Bitter Creek, on the shelf above their hearth. They kept the very first glass jar of sugar, the 5 pounds Bo had sold at the fair price. They called it their certificate of heart. It was a silent, daily reminder that their love had begun with an act of conscience. The bees were the constant symbol of disciplined labor, the creek the symbol of restored life and public resource, and the sugar the symbol of the goodness worth fighting for. Their story, in the end, was a simple, profound message for the Wyoming frontier. The West is not just a place for the quick gun. It is a place where the human heart learns to keep its word. True justice, they had shown, begins with a single, decent transaction, whether it is a fair price for sugar or an honest confession of guilt. On a cool, clear autumn night, with the kerosene lamp turned low, Bo pulled Cora close. He whispered against her hair, that low, rumbling voice full of warmth. "That day when you first came to my store," Bo mused, his voice serious. "You came to buy sugar, didn't you?" Cora rested her hand over his heart, the simple silver ring cool against his shirt. "And you, Bo McAllister," she answered, her voice soft with enduring love. "You paid for it with your heart." They shared a deep, quiet laugh. Bo reached out and snuffed the lamp, and their future, honest and sweet enough, opened out before them. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so more people can hear this story.